Hopefully you've come here because you want to understand the argument against bombing Syria, which I'll lay out to the best of my ability. If you think we should bomb Syria, or you've yet to make up your mind, then I hope you'll be a little swayed by some of the arguments here. If you already think we shouldn't bomb Syria, then I hope you can use some of these arguments to persuade others and prevent a bloody civil war from getting bloodier. As you will probably have heard if you're watching this video, there was a recent chemical weapons attack in Syria. This has largely been attributed to Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of the Syrian Arab Republic, by most mainstream media, although the evidence remains inconclusive. The images circulating on social media are horrific and likely to induce a strong emotional reaction in most ordinary people. I know I found them difficult to stomach. However, our response to this situation is likely to change the region for generations to come, so it's important to be objective in analysing the situation and take the best possible course of action. To that end, I will attempt to make my analysis as objective and rational as possible. Now, there are two possibilities. Either Assad did do it, or Assad didn't do it. So I'll look at this in three cases. I'll look at it in the case that we know Assad didn't do it, we know Assad did do it, and the case that there is doubt as to who did it. Case 1. Assad didn't do it. This seems a straightforward argument to make. The casus belli for bombing or invading Syria is apparently that they've crossed the chemical weapons line by using chemical weapons on the Syrian people. If they didn't use chemical weapons, then there is no casus belli, and no reason to bomb. Conclusion: don't bomb Syria. Simple. There are, however, broader geopolitical reasons for destroying the Syrian Arab Republic. From the Saudi point of view, Syrian Arab Republic is a secular state with a sizable Shia minority, which is more likely to align with Saudi's ideological enemy, Iran. Saudi is the Sunni hegemon, Iran the Shia one. From Israel's perspective, the Syrian Arab Republic limits its eastern expansion, contests the Golan Heights, which Israel still occupies, and presents the possibility of a future all-Arab alliance against Israel, as has happened in the past. In this worst-case scenario, all of Israel's neighbours could invade it. From the US point of view, Syria is one of Russia's few remaining allies. Furthermore, as Hillary Clinton's WikiLeaks memos explicitly state, the real reason behind most of the US's actions in the Middle East is to preserve Israel's status as the sole nuclear power in the region. Israel's nuclear trump card prevents them from being on the receiving end of any military aggression, while allowing Israel to repeatedly intervene in its neighbours' affairs via airstrikes and invasions. There is a further moral argument that Assad is a dictator and should be removed from office. While this holds little sway with international geopolitics, it is a good way of justifying military action to the average Western citizen. Unfortunately, the replacements for Assad do not appear any less repressive than the current secular dictatorship. In the northeast, Kurdish rebels appear to be carving out a state for themselves under ceasefire agreement with the Syrian Arab Republic. The other rebel factions include ISIS, the Army of Islam, al-Nusra and al-Qaeda. All of these are extreme Islamist movements that aim to create a caliphate in Syria under the rule of Sharia law, in many ways worse than secular dictatorship. Whichever rebel faction comes to power, the overwhelming likelihood is that Christian, Shia and Alawite minorities would immediately be purged from the country, resulting in genocide and a massive refugee crisis. If Assad wins the civil war, he will likely purge the country of revolutionary political opponents, which will result in mass executions, but on a smaller scale, as the secular dictatorship is restored. Case 2. Did Assad do it? I personally do not believe Assad or Putin ordered the chemical weapons attacks this year or last year. However, nor do I believe that the evidence is conclusive either way. My opposition to the idea is based on an appraisal of the Syrian Arab Republic's military situation, which is currently at its best since 2011. Assad is winning. The only thing which could lose him the war is a chemical weapons attack. Imagine you're a boxer in the 10th round of a fight. Your opponent has been smashed to pieces, is losing on points and about to throw in the towel. Would you choose this moment to pull out a knife and stab the guy? If you had this knife and the cruelty to use it, wouldn't you have used it back in the 4th round when you were on the ropes getting pummeled? To illustrate this, I've put a time-lapse of the 7-year Syrian civil war here and noted the points where there have been chemical weapons attacks. You can see that at certain stages in the conflict, in fact for most of it, Assad really was on the ropes, but not this year and not last year, thanks to concerted and courageous international efforts to defeat ISIS, which recognised that the Syrian Arab Republic and ISIS cannot both be fought against at the same time. Furthermore, Knifing your opponent in a boxing match would actually be more effective than using chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. Chemical weapons have highly tenuous tactical value in a conflict because they are as indiscriminate as they are brutal. Most of the victims were Syrian civilians. So a proper analogy would be that in this 10th round, when you're winning the fight on all counts, you suddenly stab a random member of the audience. There's no rational reason to do this, which is why it's never happened in the history of boxing, despite many boxers being crazy and unsportsmanlike enough to do something like that. I can't see any convincing reason why the Syrian Arab Republic would use chemical weapons now. The least weak argument I've heard is that Putin is telling Assad to use chemical weapons in order to goad the US into military involvement. Well, if that's the case, why let ourselves be goaded? Why show ourselves to the world as fools who throw trillion-dollar armies around on the most dubious of evidence? Far more likely, to my eyes, is that a rebel group committed these attacks in order to bring in the overwhelming firepower of the US Air Force to stop them losing the war. This is termed a false flag attack, and the losing party has every motive to carry it out. The rebels are facing total annihilation unless they do something drastic. Conclusion: Assad probably didn't do it. Don't bomb Syria. Case 3. Assad did do it. Let's suppose that Assad did order the attack, either to goad the US, or because he's literally insane, or because some short-sighted general in the Syrian Arab Republic's hierarchy got hold of the launch codes. Should we launch the bomber fleet? First of all, we have to revisit the red line put in place by Obama over the use of chemical weapons all those years ago. What was the situation then, and the reason for the red line? Well, apart from the US administration possibly itching to go to war, the Syrian civil war was in a more even situation back then. The Syrian Arab Republic had less territory, and ISIS was the second most powerful force there, with the rebels holding vast swathes of Syria. Whatever happened, the war was going to go on for a long time. Let's be generous and say that it was in the interests of the world hegemon, the US, to prevent the sort of atrocities in the region that might lead other nations to criticize the US's handling of world affairs. If Assad were allowed to use chemical weapons without immediate retaliation, there was a danger, especially if he lost the war, as was hoped, that he might resort to using the entire national stockpile of chemical weapons, resulting in horrific atrocities. Something forceful had to be done to dissuade this. The situation today is very different. The civil war looks to be in its closing stages, thank God. There isn't actually that much more time for Assad to use chemical weapons. Even if he did, for whatever crazy reason, use chemical weapons this week, there's no reason to think that Western military action will make the situation better. We have to look at what possible outcomes there are from intervention. This is my part 2, a study of Western intervention. We have to look at the likely outcomes of Western military intervention in Syria to determine whether it's a good response. I have great respect for our military, if not for the lunatic politicians with their fingers on the button, and have no doubt they will acquit themselves well in war. However, good performance by our militaries does not necessarily result in a good outcome for the planet, as we've seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and other places. Case 1. Ineffective bombing campaign. Like last year's missile strikes, let's suppose we let off a great display of sound and fury signifying nothing. We take out perhaps a couple of bases or depots, kill a few dozen Syrian soldiers, pat ourselves on the back and head home for tea. This is basically, broadly speaking, what happened last year. A great PR stunt for the top leaders in the short term, but really a vacuous political statement that will likely undermine confidence in the long term. Is it worth it? Is it worth the expense to go to this option? Then we have case 2, an effective bombing campaign. Let's suppose we commit to an overwhelming assault which severely cripples the Syrian Arab Republic's ability to wage war. What this achieves is that the Syrian civil war will be prolonged by several years, resulting in thousands more deaths and tens of thousands more refugees. Islamist rebels then use air cover to regain lost territory and strengthen their position, while we at home count up billions of dollars in expenditure and buy new munitions. In 2 to 4 years' time, however, Assad will likely have recovered, especially with Russian and Iranian support. It's very likely that the situation will return to where it is at present. There may even be another dubious chemical attack and further intervention. All we will get for our money and our lives spent is creating more chaos and extending the terrible situation as it exists at present. Case 3 is invasion. Even an overwhelming air support program is unlikely to win the war for the rebels. What's needed, if that's our objective, is an effective ground army. This might be achieved by special forces detachments operating within rebel units in order to provide combat support and advice. And it may be that that's happening even as I speak. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. However, once the West commits to sending ground troops in support of rebels, we will find it very difficult to extricate them and let the rebels lose. The end result will likely be the defeat of the Syrian Arab Republic and the installation of some Islamist regime, as happened in Libya. If the US leads with the ground invasion, there may be more options for setting up a secular democracy, but we will likely find ourselves following the template of Iraq and Afghanistan, spending trillions of dollars to maintain an armed occupation of the region while trying and failing to prop up an unpopular democracy, let alone all of the thousands of lives spent in this futile game. Let's note that all of these outcomes are bad, leading to much more human death and suffering than simply leaving the civil war alone. Even if Assad did carry out the attacks, military intervention only makes the situation worse. Conclusion: don't bomb Syria. Now there is a footnote to this, and that's conflict with Russia. It is hard to imagine Russia getting involved in a live-fire war against the sophisticated and overpowered armies of the US and Europe. However, Russian weapons and special forces teams will likely be active in the region, and while it may not be acknowledged by either side's media, there will be direct conflict. This happened in the proxy war between the UN and USSR in Korea 1950 to 1953, where Russian pilots routinely flew sorties over North Korean territory. Moving back to the present, Russia has invested in very sophisticated surface-to-air missile technology, which the Syrian Arab Republic also maintains. Proxy conflict with Russia over Syria would significantly increase the expected US and European casualties, as well as hammering the nail in the coffin of any of that US-Russian rapprochement which Donald Trump's election seemed to promise. The only eventuality by which the US intervention may turn nuclear is if the West response to assertive Russian defense of their Syrian ally is invading Russia directly. I know from first hand that British military engineers have been surveying routes for direct invasion of Russia. Such studies are actually routine and happen all the time. In the 1930s, the US had a complete plan for invading Canada, for example. However, the personnel I spoke to seemed relatively confident that their services would be called upon, for what it's worth. Personally, I don't believe there's any reasonable chance of the West invading Russia, because Russia is so massive that it's hard to come up with a political plan for dealing with the aftermath of such an attack. I don't think invasion of Syria would directly lead to World War III, but I don't think it needs to. Millions of dead and displaced are bad enough. Don't bomb Syria. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. Hopefully there was something in it that was useful to you, despite my patronising voice and fumbling around with all of the controls and editing software and basically everything. Hopefully I'll get better in future and there'll be more interesting things to watch and listen to. Thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.